body dissolving and I'll still be there. And I said, well, how interesting, you know. But eventually it just surrendered somehow. And it wasn't afraid. And what was interesting for me, it was that I didn't feel any, whatever, because I can't describe what it is. It wasn't afraid of not existing after death. And that was interesting to see. I was curious. I was like, how interesting. It's not afraid to die. It's not afraid to stop existing. And then it's just nothing for the rest of nothing. There was just experiencing the breath arising and falling, and then just going deeper into that experience. So that was powerful. And I'm curious because I don't think this may be medular for me to understand this. I have a question. It's a teaching that I've received before, but it doesn't stay with me. And it's the question about how can I understand dependent arising or dependent origination? For some reason, it escapes my mind. I can't seem to understand it very well. Sorry if it's a deep concept. I don't want to derail you for the rest of the teaching.
No.
But it's something kind of difficult for me to understand.
Well, there's that, of course. And I think there's truth in what he says, that to keep reflecting on this will probably reveal some elements of it. I mean, the term dependent arising is one that comes from the very beginnings of Buddhism, and the simple formulation of it that the Buddha taught to some of his very earliest disciples was along the lines of this simple formula: this being that arises. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. This ceasing, that ceases. From the ceasing of this comes the ceasing of that. It's almost like X goes to Y, no X goes to no Y. might come up. But let's then return to the text. And I didn't, though I said on the sheet that before lunch we would get up through verse 38. I didn't really talk about, and I won't say much about the sort of three last verses in the Vipassana meditation section. This is verses 36, 37, and 38. So after the meditation has been described, the Vipassana goes on and says, in brief, as related by my spiritual friend, Sangye Yeshe, spiritual friend, of course, is one possible translation for the term Gewe Shenyan, which is usually shortened to Geshe. And so when we hear Geshe as a title, it really is a very specific application of this more general term that refers to someone who is a spiritual friend, really is a mentor to one. So he's talking about Sangye Yeshe, and he had said that he was going to relate this meditation in a way that it had been taught to him by Sangye Yeshe, and so he's bringing it back to Sangye Yeshe, who, of course, he acknowledges his teacher as omniscient. And so then there's a quotation from a verse that is found in the collected writings of Sangye Yeshe, to the effect that this kind of is a sort of a pithy, poetic way of expressing what one is supposed to realize through this meditation. He says, when you're fully aware that whatever appears is conceptually apprehended. So that's really just the point I was making, this subtlest level of the understanding of dependent arising, that all of this is just conceptually apprehended. Then the Dharma realm, that is the realm of reality as it really is, dawns independently of anything else. It just it happens. It's not, on some level, of course, it is dependently arisen. We have to admit that. But experientially, it's as if, there it is. It dawns. Just like when the dawn arrives, suddenly it's been dark, and then there's the first indications of light in the morning. When awareness rests within this dawning, and you settle in single-pointed meditative equipoise or concentration, ema. Ema is one of these untranslatable Tibetan expressions that you could say it's like wonderful, but even wonderful doesn't quite capture it. If you ever read the poetry of Milarepa, he's full of these kinds of expressions, keho, ema-ho, and so forth. So this is just a sort of poetic, pithy poetic expression of what it's like, how wonderful it is to experience this. And he then adds, along the same lines, Dampa Sangye. This is Padampa Sangye, who I've mentioned a couple of times, who was this great South Indian master who, among other things, introduced the pacification tradition of meditation, which is related to Mahamudra, and who also was the one who liked to demonstrate the nature of mind through gestures and actions rather than just words. Anyway, Padampa Sangye was a famous set of verses that he uttered to the people of Dingri, which is an area of Tibet just over the border from Nepal, not too far from Mount Everest, I don't think. It says, whirl the sphere of awareness within emptiness. The view, O Dingripas, is unobstructed. So it's another poetic way of imagining what it is like to have awareness within the sphere of emptiness, in this case, spinning a sphere. So that really is the conclusion of the Vipassana section there, with those three verses of sort of additional explanation or celebration or commentary. And now the rest is and there's really only a few verses left. The rest is going to be sort of afterwards, right? It says here, afterward, the virtue that has arisen from meditating on Mahamudra together with a sea of virtues collected in the 3 times, should be dedicated to great unexcelled awakening. And this is really a kind of standard expression of the dedication of merit. So at the end of your session, of course, just as you begin the session with refuge and bodhicitta, guru yoga at the very least, so at the end of the session, you dedicate the merit, always. That's what rounds it out as a truly Mahayana practice. So there's nothing in there that's, I think, particularly problematic, because you're very familiar with that language, I think. So then, really what happens starting in verse 40 and almost to the very end is what would be called the post-meditation instructions. This is the instructions for, okay, you've had your session, you've dedicated the merit, now you go forth into the world, you get off the cushion. And these are going to be a series of instructions on how we ought to approach this. So he says in verse 40, having familiarized yourself thusly, you must realize precisely the mode of appearance of any object appearing to the 6 types of consciousness. So the 6 types of consciousness are, of course, the consciousnesses of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mind, standard Buddhist list, going right back to the beginning. And you have to understand the mode of appearance. Now, this is a slightly technical term. When it gets into these kinds of discussions, they'll talk about modes of appearance, modes of existing, modes of grasping, and so forth. The mode of appearance, typically of any object, when you get up from the cushion and you're back in the world, is that object will appear to you as if it had intrinsic existence. Granted, you've just been meditating on emptiness, where if you're doing it right, there is no sense whatsoever of intrinsic existence. But as soon as you go back into the world, boom, things assault you with their thingness, with this sense that they have somehow an intrinsic reality. By now, you probably don't believe that on an intellectual level, but still, we're so deeply conditioned. Our grasping itself is so deep and innate that we can't carry over that understanding, the realization of emptiness into the real world, at least not in a direct sense right now. So you have to, anything that you encounter, there's some part of your mind that's supposed to be recognizing, this is appearing to me as if it were intrinsically existent, but it isn't. And this is why, I'm not sure if he'll use this term exactly, but they often talk about the way you should understand things in post-meditation, i.e. in most of life, is as illusion-like. Now, it's important to understand this is illusion-like. It doesn't mean it's not real, right? This is the Gela. They accept the reality of the conventional world on a conventional level. But you also have to recognize that an illusion is something that appears in the way it is not, or it's in the appearance of something that is not. And so you have to be able to recognize what appears to you as if it intrinsically existed as not intrinsically existing. Doesn't mean it's not conventionally real. It's definitely conventionally real. But there's a famous Ramakrishna story about a disciple of his who, been trained in seeing things as illusory and, was practicing so hard and so devoutly on this. And he was in the jungle and an elephant came down the path rather fast towards him. And he just sort of, it's an illusion, and he got tossed by the elephant. He survived, fortunately, and he went to Ramakrishna and said, You know, I tried to remember. I'm sure I really felt that this elephant was an illusion, and Ramakrishna said, "Yeah, but the elephant didn't know that." so the reality has its hardness, you know. You gotta respect convention. You can't just wish it away.
Next time, tell the elephant you're an illusion.
Anyway, so he says, you know, so anyway, you try to realize the mode of apprehension, or mode of appearance of any object appearing to the six types of consciousness. Its mode of being, that is the way that it actually is, its real nature, will then nakedly and vividly appear. Identification of whatever appears is the key to the view. So identifying the actual nature of whatever appears to you as being empty is the key to having the view in all circumstances. He says, he adds, in short, whatever appears, whether your own mind or something else, should not be taken to be real. That is real in the sense of ultimately existent, permanent, partless, independent, self-sufficient, existing only from its own side. You should ascertain its mode of being and always maintain that awareness. Knowing this, subsume all phenomena of samsara and nirvana into a single nature. So everything that you encounter, everything that there is, needs to be understood as empty. And again, where we are on the path, even where a high-level bodhisattva is on the path, none of us will be in a position where we can simultaneously directly realize emptiness and perceive conventionalities. It's only, at least according to Gelo tradition, but I think this is probably true of most of the traditions, you only have the complete simultaneity of the realization of emptiness and the perception of conventional phenomena when you're a fully enlightened Buddha. You get closer and closer and closer and closer, and in very high-level bodhisattvas, you can hardly tell the difference. It seems that everything they're doing, or everything they're saying, or everything they're seeing is completely simultaneous with the realization of the emptiness of that, but it actually isn't. It's probably going so rapidly back and forth that it appears to be a continuous thing, but it does. For us here, it's like, okay, here's my fake emptiness, and here's the stuff I really like, and it feels pretty real to me, and that's okay much of the time. But as we kind of work along, they begin to get closer, and you begin to be able to bring out that recognition of emptiness sometimes. Not in a real way, but at least in a good fake way, into your ordinary encounters and conversations and so forth. And eventually it all does become everything is of the same taste and there's no distinction left. Since he had commented before about so whatever appears, whether your own mind or something else, he's referring to various possible objects of meditation. Obviously, this being a Mahamudra text, the nature of mind is what's paramount. But he then has this quotation from Aryadeva, who's of course the one sort of recognized great disciple of Nagarjuna, so the second of the great Madhyamaka teachers of India. And Aryadeva writes, the viewer of one entity is explained as the viewer of all. The emptiness of one is the emptiness of all. And this makes the very important practical point that if you realize the emptiness of whatever your chosen meditation object is, once you've got that, you don't have to then say, oh, but what about the chair? My mind is empty, but what about the chair? If you get the emptiness of one thing, you get the emptiness of everything. What the proper object of meditation for a meditation on emptiness is really an individual. Well, it's a matter, if you have a teacher, it's between you and the teacher, but if you're not working so closely with the teacher, then it's a matter of finding what you have an affinity for. the mind, meditating on the mind, the way Mahamudra practitioners do, is on some level, this gets me back to some of the things I said on Friday night, it's very direct because you're meditating on that which is doing the meditating. It's right there. It's just the mind. It's even closer than your own breath in a way. But it has this difficulty of the mind trying to see itself. And so I think for many people, taking an external object, and most commonly it'll be something like, well, the self that might exist within the aggregates, or you could take something, some physical object. It's a matter of what's comfortable for you. But if you do it right, it's going to amount to the same thing. And so whatever your chosen object of meditation, once you actually realize the empty nature of that, it will apply everywhere. You'll understand the nature, the ultimate nature of whatever else you may encounter. So he goes on, thus within, so he's going to specify here, so thus within a proper meditative equipoise on reality. So when you're on the cushion, right, that's what he's talking about here, you are free from elaborated extremes of samsara and nirvana. This term elaborated, trupa, in Tibetan is like conceptual elaboration, conceptuality. Tru means to, Stephen Beyer, one of my graduate school professors, translated it as it's a little fanciful, he just described it as busy work. And and sometimes people, there's a particular, one of the yogas of Mahamudra, meditation in the Kagyu, is to drel, which means lack of elaboration or freedom from elaboration. But sometimes people will just describe it as simplicity, which is another way of putting that idea. Anyway, you're free from elaborated extremes of samsara and nirvana. The elaborated extremes typically are, of course, definitely exists, absolutely doesn't exist. Eternalism and nihilism, these are the classic extremes that the Buddha sought to avoid, and that Madhyamikas in particular insist we ought to avoid. But actually all Buddhists talk about avoiding this. Then they just disagree on where the middle is, but I won't go there. So you're free from notions of existence, non-existence, and so forth with regard to either samsara or nirvana. Yet, when you arise from that equipoise, so verse 43 is talking about when you're on the cushion, you're in a state where you're free from any kind of elaborated extreme, any kind of conceptuality. Then, when you arise from that equipoise and analyze, it is undeniable that dependently arisen actions and agents naturally appear as mere names, only labels, like a dream, a mirage, the moon in water, or an illusion. So this is that highest level of understanding of dependent arising, that things only arise for us in this way, and that therein, because of this equivalency between dependent arising and emptiness, if things exist for us or arise for us as mere designations, as mere names, and if this is the subtlest and most important level of dependent arising, and dependent arising equals emptiness, then this is a recognition of emptiness. So this is how, this gives you a good feel for what I meant before when I said somewhat more abstractly, things appear as illusion-like. That is how they appear to us, or how we need to understand them anyway. They appear to us as if they're real. We need to understand that they are like illusions, that they're deceiving us. And he goes on, when the empty is not obscured by appearances, and appearances are not negated by the empty, the excellent path, where emptiness and dependent arising have a single meaning, so here he finally lays this out explicitly, will be manifest. So, this important matter of appearances not obscuring the fact that they are empty. So when we can see through appearances, see through our instinctive sense that these appearances somehow exist intrinsically, then appearances are no longer obscuring their actual empty nature. And by the same token, when we have a recognition of emptiness, or we're in a state of emptiness, this does not negate in the slightest the arising of appearances. In fact, to go back to the point I made from Nagarjuna earlier, it's only because things are empty that they can appear. If things were not empty, nothing could appear, nothing would change, there would be no world. So it's this perfect harmony between conventional dependent arising and ultimate emptiness that is kind of the heart of, I mean, that's the heart of the Gelug understanding of Madhyamaka. It's really at the heart, however complicated they may seem, it's really at the heart of the meditations on emptiness, and it's at the heart of the way in which we need to try to live in the world and encounter the world. This doesn't capture this entirely, but one of my favorite expressions comes from, I'm a big fan of the Beats. Not all of you perhaps even know who the Beats are, but this was a very important literary movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in the US. Names like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, Diane DePrima. There's quite an array of great literary figures, many of whom were deeply into Buddhism. And there's I don't know, has anybody read Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums? Anyway, yeah, one or two of you. Wonderful book about his experiences in the Bay Area, kind of tripping around with, it's a novel, so everybody's given a different name, but basically it's about his friendship with Gary Snyder, who's a great American poet and environmentalist pioneer. He's turning 90 this year. Still has his ring of bone zendo in the Sierra Nevadas. Anyway, at some point they're climbing a mountain in the Sierra Nevadas, and Kerouac, his character tells the Gary Snyder character, you know, I've developed this little prayer that I go around and say, at least to myself, every time I meet somebody. And the prayer goes like this: Jose, equally empty, equally to be pitied, equally a coming Buddha, which is it's absolutely beautiful. Kerouac had his own problems. He died a drunk. He abandoned Buddhism, et cetera, but he had some sparkling insights, and there's something of that I feel in this as well. So he concludes the text with his sort of sign off, if you will. I, who am called Losangchuki Gyaltsen, a renunciant who has heard many discourses. Another way of translating this, but it struck me as immodest if you did it this way, would be to say, who knows a lot. But it's more modest than that. Excessive boasting is bad form in a Buddhist master. So anyway, he says, by my virtue, and this is really the dedication of the merit of the composition of the work, right? By my virtue, may all beings quickly become conquerors through this path, the door to peace, apart from which there is no second. So when he says there is no other path than this, he's not saying everybody's got to do Mahamudra. Or if you're going to interpret Mahamudra as simply being synonymous with realization of emptiness or meditation on emptiness, then yes, everybody needs to do it, but you don't necessarily have to do it in this form. One of the problems with the term Mahamudra, which I've perhaps alluded to, or perhaps you inferred it from some of what I said Friday night, is that it comes to have so many meanings in so many different ways that you begin to wonder, is there anything out there that isn't Mahamudra? And in fact, there's a wonderful series of verses written by one of the great early Rico Kagyu lamas talking about how the different tantric seals, I made only very brief reference to these on Friday, the action seal, dharma seal, pledge seal, and great seal, or Mahamudra, actually are found in all the different Buddhist traditions, and he kind of ingeniously lays out what each of these seals would mean in the Shravaka path, or the Pratyeka Buddha path, or the Bodhisattva path, or sort of basic tantra, advanced tantra, and so forth. So there's, if you recall, the very first verse of this text, in his kind of homage to his guru, he talked about his guru teaching him Mahamudra, which is the all-pervasive nature of everything. Well, in a weird way, if Mahamudra is simply about the nature of reality, then the nature of reality is everywhere, whether we like it or not, whether we recognize it or not. That, of course, from his point of view, is emptiness, but it's an emptiness that is in complete harmony with dependent arising. So I won't go over the colophon. This would be the equivalent of what, in our cultural context, would actually be the preface, or more like the preface to the book. It talks about who asked him to do this, and he does make some interesting mention of his predecessor, not immediate predecessor, but in the lineage, two masters removed, Ensapa, who supposedly had said, well, there's this Mahamudra teaching, but we're not going to talk about it. And then he quotes the Lotus Sutra to similar effect, the Buddha having said, well, there's times for talking about some things and times you need to shut up about them. I'm paraphrasing a lot here. But he's basically saying, he felt that it was time to do this. I should mention, by the way, and this is a slightly pedantic footnote, but it's a point that might be confusing to some of you if you run into different references. I've described him most typically, and most people usually will, Losam Chukyi Gyaltsen, as the first Panchen Lama. But if you followed any of the controversies that have surrounded the identity of the current Panchen Lama, this Panchen Lama, whether it's the one that the Dalai Lama recognized and then was spirited off and we haven't seen him since, or the one that the Chinese recognized and gets sent out to Tashi Lungpo every once in a while. Regardless, we leave the politics out of it for the moment. He's referred to as the 11th Panchen Lama. Those two represent completely different systems of numbering Panchen Lamas, because it came to be recognized later that Losam Chukyi Gyaltsen was actually a Pitulku, or a reincarnation of Gyalwa Ensapa, who was this figure two jumps earlier in the tradition, and that Ensapa in turn was the incarnation, I'm not sure I'm going to remember the name, Choklang Rinpoche, whatever it was, there was a figure, and then that the very first Panchen Lama was actually this great disciple of Tsongkhapa's Khedrubche. So that would make Losam Chukyi Gyaltsen the fourth Panchen Lama. So I sometimes just say first/fourth, because there's a slightly confusing way of figuring all of this out. But you will probably see first Panchen. He was the first, in effect, the first Dalai Lama to know he was a Dalai Lama, if I may be so bold as to put it this way, was actually the third Dalai Lama. The term did not exist until Sunam Gyatso, a great Gelugpa monk, went to visit the Mongol court in the 1570s, and in an exchange of pleasantries and titles and gifts and whatnot, as would be befitting encounters between a sort of a high political potentate and a high lama, the Mongol chieftain Altan Khan designated him as basically great ocean, or ocean of wisdom, and the word in Mongol for ocean is Dalai. So he was the Dalai Lama, the master or the guru, the oceanic guru. And that then was taken over into Tibetan, in effect, although Tibetans don't typically, I mean, for Westerners, they will refer to the Dalai Lama as the Dalai Lama, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which is, of course, the more respectful way. But Tibetans will actually usually refer to him as Yishin Normu, which literally means the wish-fulfilling jewel. That's the kind of honorific name that they use for the current Dalai Lama and that they've used for previous Dalai Lamas. They're also called Gelwa or conquerors. There's a variety of different. Again, these are sort of footnotes in a way, but in the same way, Chökyi Gyaltsen was designated probably by the fourth Dalai Lama as the Panchen, the great scholar, the great pundit. And Losang Chökyi Gyaltsen, I didn't say a great deal about his career, but he was a tutor to both the fourth and the fifth Dalai Lamas. And the fifth Dalai Lama was, of course, the Dalai Lama who, with the considerable help of Mongol armies, unified at least central Tibet under the control of the Gelug and of the Ganden Pochang, as it's called, the fortress at Ganden, Ganden being the first of the great Gelug monasteries. So again, it depends on how you count. Questions? I want to close by looking at least a little bit at some poetry, and we'll sort of get through what we can. But having come to the end of the Panchen's text, it seems an appropriate moment to pause and at least see if there are questions about the content of it or the meditations in it or any other element of it that anybody wants to raise right now.
General questions, or is that later? Just other questions? Or?
No, it's fine. It's fine. This is a good time.
Yeah, I have a question. Does everybody that attain the rainbow body, does it mean that the person becomes fully enlightened?
That's the presumption. As best I can understand it. Yeah, that you would not leave behind the rainbow, not go out by way of the rainbow body, leaving a few, whatever it is you leave behind, unless you were fully enlightened. And my understanding, but again, the rainbow body is discussed considerably more in Nyingma and Kagyu settings, especially Nyingma, so I'm not quite as familiar with it, but my sense is that it often implies that there will be no particular rebirth of that being, but I could be wrong about that, so please don't take that as gospel. But that's one of the ways in which, as the title of the book has it, great beings die, is to sort of project themselves into the nature of reality, the realm of reality, leaving. Usually there's a few physical remains that are left behind, but just not much of anything. The alternative, the one that I hear discussed much more in Gelug settings, but of course it happens elsewhere as well, is for the Lama at the time of death to enter, to perform various tantric practices that will take him or her into the indestructible drop at the center of the heart chakra and enter the state known as Tukdam. Tukdam is really just a term that it literally means to bind the mind or a pledge of the mind, but it's generally speaking, it's just a word for meditation, but it's come to refer specifically to, as it were, the death meditation. And in this state, as I think most of you will be aware, and for instance, Geshe Sopa, when he passed away, was in Tukdam for 6 to 7 days. And we were actually allowed to go into his room to meditate while he was in Tukdam. And the features of Tukdam typically are, the assumption is that the Lama is meditating on the nature of reality very deeply inside. And this only occurs after the person is declared medically dead. So Geshe Zopa was certified as dead by the county coroner or his doctor or whoever it might be, but there was another week in which he was sitting, sitting/leaning on his bed, and the traditional description is that there's no bodily decomposition that sets in whatsoever. I mean, even when you get up to a week, and there have been even longer reports of longer tukdam than that, and that there's still, if you were to hold your hand near the heart level, there's usually a kind of a warmth that is evident. And this, from the Tibetan standpoint, this indicates that consciousness, which is residing in the heart, has not yet left the body, and it becomes a matter on some level of choice for the Lama when he or she will then leave the body. And the presumption there, I mean, at that point, there are many options. One could go to a pure realm of some sort and not return. One could also, and this is often the case in contemporary and earlier Tibetan culture, choose to incarnate. And so Geshe Zopa, it's presumed, will incarnate, although I will tell you that there are credible stories to the effect that he really resisted the idea, essentially had to be talked into it by His Holiness the Dalai Lama. There's controversy among Tibetans about the whole tulku system, because it's not, there's a spiritual explanation of it, which is, of course, the highly realized master can choose where he or she will be reborn, should he or she choose to be reborn. But it also is part of a vast and complicated, and sometimes it must be said corrupt, social and political system that has important economic ramifications. And the Tibetans have debated among themselves whether this system ought to be maintained. I've heard, although I don't have it on absolutely good authority, that not long after the Tibetans arrived in India in 1859, the Dalai Lama got together with the heads of the major orders, and they said, let's junk the system. It's been misused way too much, and there was actually a short period where no incarnations were recognized, and then somebody broke ranks, and then everybody else broke ranks, and it was back to business as usual. But I've read recently that His Holiness the Dalai Lama and some others have been bringing up again the possibility that maybe this whole system, which is really, it's a uniquely Tibeto-Mongol system. That is the sort of inner Asian cultures that were influenced by what we would call Tibetan Buddhism, are the only ones that have sort of pushed this through in quite the way they have. And it wasn't there at the beginning in Tibet either. It was started around the time of the second or the third Karmapa in the 14th century. So anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a digression. But the point is that there's a number of different ways in which a great master may die. And rainbow body is certainly one of the possibilities. And again, among Gelugpas, I've tended to hear more about tukdam, but other schools will talk about this as well. And there are Richie Davidson, whose name a few of you may know, is a very well-known neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin, has actually done some tests on lamas in tukdam, basically with the permission of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And none of this has really been published yet. I don't even know if it will be, but it raises interesting questions. If you detect really subtle neurological activity when a being is in tukdam, maybe that tells you something. If you don't discover any neurological activity, maybe that tells you something. I think the thing that, as I've thought about this over the years, and it's kind of mind-blowing to consider the possibilities. The thing that has struck me as unquestionable about reports like this and experiences like this is that probably we don't know everything there is to know about death. that we can safely say, and that maybe the Tibetans have something to tell us about some aspects of that. Maybe they're not right about every detail of it, but there's something there.
One more question about Lama Tsongkhapa didn't achieve Buddhahood in his body. He was
Correct.
in the Bardo. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, this has to do with the fact that it is presumed in almost all Tibetan traditions, and certainly it's accepted in the Gelug tradition, which is a heavily monastic tradition, that you cannot achieve full enlightenment in this current body without practicing the completion stage of highest yoga tantra in the literal sense of taking a consort to assist you with the movement of energies within the subtle body that are the prelude to enlightenment. And so Tsongkhapa was intent on, and one of his great crusades during his lifetime was for the kind of reestablishment or the shoring up of the purity of monastic vows. And although there were monks who sometimes would take consorts, and that's been true in recent times as well, he felt that it would, in effect, that it would be a bad example if he were to take a consort. And so he opted not to. It's of course possible to have a visualized consort. And even in his early retreats in the 1390s that I mentioned on Friday night, his great disciple, the one to whom he handed the Mahamudra and other traditions, Tokten Jangpo Gyatso, reported seeing like a dakini coming and going to this female spiritual helper, coming and going to Tsongkhapa's room. But it's presumed that this was all visionary and that he never had an actual consort. And so it's only if you haven't taken an actual physical consort, an action seal, as the technical term is, during your lifetime, then at the moment of death, as you enter the bardo or whatever happens, then enlightenment will be immediate, because all the equipment, everything is there except for that particular physical practice that aids one during this particular lifetime. So that's my understanding of it anyway. Then you get different stories about where Tsongkhapa ended up. And it's generally presumed that he's a Buddha and an enlightened being. But then still, maybe he's in Tushita, maybe he's there. I should say, I didn't put this on the syllabus or on the bibliography, but I think I may have mentioned it. If I did mention it, I'll repeat it. And if I didn't, I want to make sure to mention it, that Thupten Jinpa, who is known to many of you as the Dalai Lama's translator in the West, into English anyway, has just published with Shambhala Publications the definitive biography of Tsongkhapa. It's an extraordinary work of scholarship. I mean, he's read everything out there, all the biographies, all the early ones, the later ones, what other people had to say about Tsongkhapa. It's an amazing, amazing work, and it comes out, of course, as most of you are aware, just before the 600th passing away or final nirvana anniversary of Tsongkhapa, which is going to be celebrated the 21st of this month on Ganden Namcha, which is the sort of great celebration of Tsongkhapa every December-ish. It's often the same as Hanukkah, I've noticed, but that's lunar calendars at work. Sorry, you have one more?
Last question.
Yeah.
One last question.
No, you've been slaving away half the time, so you should have your opportunity. I'm very appreciative.
Thank you for your time. I'm still not clear whether the mind can look at the mind. I'm still not clear. Like I think you mentioned that different schools have different answers for this, and it's the title of this, the mind seeing the mind.
Right.
And I don't know if you can explain it again. I think that the mind can see the mind, but anyway.
You think it can?
I think that's what I gravitate towards that.
Yeah.
But I know I've also heard the thing that a knife cannot
cut itself, or a fire burn itself. Right. So, Yeah, and again, I talked a little bit about that earlier on, and those arguments against the idea of mind seeing mind are very much, they're aimed at, they're part of the critique of the Yogacara idealist position. And so they're particularly talking about ideas within the Yogacara tradition. But even if we leave that aside, it is a kind of a paradox, there's no doubt about it, because the mind, we think of the mind as the subject, and the subject has objects. So how can that which is a subject be an object? I mean, it's that simple in a way. And I've got to say that in my reflections on this, and I've got no fixed answer to this myself, to be honest, but I think that we kind of have to give up and this is part of the point of Mahamudra meditation too, right? We have to give up this obsession with subjects and objects, right? That in a way, it's not like the mind, and they will talk this way, granted, the text will say this, the mind is the object of the mind. So you can only, how do you imagine that, right? It's, again, maybe a part of the mind is looking at another part of the mind. I mean, that was, epistemologically, that's the only way I can really make sense of it. And I think there's some evidence for that. But that still leaves tricky questions. And for me, it's more like it's something that has to be entered into. You have to, in a way, as the text sometimes say, you have to relax into it. And then it will be the mind seeing itself, but you won't be aware of it as a subject seeing an object. The minute if you're doing this meditation, right, and you keep, okay, clarity and awareness, boom, you've blown it right there, really. Right? Because you're using words, like space, whoops, well, that's an image too. There's a way in which it really does beggar description in the end. And yet, there's no doubt that in some way we can, and this is why, it's interesting to me, I've got a Nyingma teacher in Minneapolis whom I respect deeply. And when he talks about shamatha meditation, I haven't gotten into some of these kind of scholastic details, but the type of meditation of which shamatha is an example let's see, I'm blanking on the Tibetan term now, but most people will call it placement meditation. You place the mind on an object and you keep it there. He talks about it as relaxation meditation. That's the English term. He knows English quite well, and that's the term he's chosen. And there's something. I think he's onto something there. That we can. I'm not sure we can fully capture intellectually. Yes, we can come up with various scholastic explanations, and I'm sure we can read those. But I don't think any of those perhaps is ultimately satisfactory, and that in a way you have to sort of do it to get a sense of what this paradox refers to.
The thoughts are part of the mind? The thoughts are a part of the mind, or?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the term mind itself can be used. It's a slippery term. I think often, sometimes the term mind will simply mean awareness, right, or consciousness, the bare perception of an object. But sometimes mind, I think this is often the way it is in West, actually, but you'll see this in Buddhist context as well, that the mind refers to this complex of different factors, right? Basic awareness, the different mental factors that are at play in every moment of consciousness, and so forth. And then there's, there's a sort of an old saying, it's a little outdated and maybe a little ethnically insensitive, but to the effect that, the Eskimo, so-called Eskimo languages or Inuit languages have like 40 different words for snow. And I think it can well be said that Buddhist Sanskrit has probably got 40 different words for mind, consciousness, awareness, and sometimes the distinctions are very fine, and sometimes it really doesn't matter. But it's the koan of this whole thing. You're absolutely right. Okay, maybe one more, maybe? Yeah.
I had this question forever about the role of like women wanting to be illuminated at that time, and how maybe only men could strive for illumination because of all of this consort things with the energies, and how did that work back then for women?
Okay, so you're asking.
Going back to what you were talking about.
You're talking about it, but specifically in, say, the Indian tantric and then Tibetan traditions, not going all the way back to what the Buddha thought about women or anything.
Maybe a summary of everything.
Well, okay. All right. That's a test. So as many of you know, I think you all will have heard this, the Buddha was reluctant to ordain women. He started a male sangha, and it was only really under pressure from his great aunt, Mahaprajapati, who had raised him because his mother died after a week, and from his cousin and closest disciple, Ananda, that he finally, reluctantly, several years into his ministry, if you will, conceded that okay, I will ordain women. And there was no doubt, I should say, ever in the early traditions that both women and men could attain enlightenment. But it was also, I think, generally assumed that the monastic life was most conducive to the attaining of enlightenment. So while there was no denial that women could be enlightened early on, they were effectively prohibited from the social means that would make that easiest. And of course, when he agreed to ordain women, the texts tell us, there's debate about these texts, the texts tell us that he said, well, I'm going to do this, I'm paraphrasing a lot here, but the Dharma's not going to last as long. It's going to be reduced by at least 500 years. What's more, I'm going to lay on to the women, to the bhikshunis, a whole special set of vows that were not given to men, of which the most important probably, and I think the first, is that any nun, we'll call them nuns, bhikshuni is really the more proper term, any nun or bhikshuni, even of 100 years ordination, should she meet a male novice just ordained that day, should she meet him on the road, she has to bow to him. And that's sort of the tenor of these. And contemporary Buddhists will turn all sorts of cartwheels and twist themselves in various directions, inside out, trying to show that no, the Buddha couldn't possibly have been a sexist. And I will reserve judgment on the matter. I would just point out that we have to be very careful about applying contemporary social standards to somebody who lived 2,500 years ago, a half a world away. And some people will say, the most common explanation I'll hear is that he did this because he resisted ordaining women because he recognized that given this, that he was a feminist at heart, but I'm getting a skeptical look or two here. He was a feminist at heart, but recognized that given social conditions in his time, if he went too far in affirming the social status of women by ordaining them, it would hurt the Dharma, that people would turn away from the Dharma, and that his larger project of making sure the Dharma outlived him would be damaged. I leave you to judge that as you will, but I would just report that that's the most common justification that I've heard, that it was in effect a kind of skillful means. Anyway, to jump ahead, he did ordain women. Women's ordination was, again, given the social conditions, was not a tremendously successful experiment in most respects. The lineage tended to die out after a number of centuries in various places, and to some places, full ordination was never transmitted. It was never transmitted to Tibet, as far as we know. Now, in current circumstances, things have changed a little. And the same is true in Sri Lanka. They had a women's ordination lineage of full ordination for several hundred years at least. But then in the midst of political chaos, when the Sangha got disorganized and was afflicted in various ways, the female Sangha, because of course it was less supported typically, dropped away. The male Sangha survived, and then starting in the 19th century, women would just start putting on robes and taking 10 vows and saying, they weren't called bhikshunis because they didn't, or bhikkhunis because they didn't have the vows, but nevertheless they started doing that. Now, of course, as many of you are aware, there are a number of women from these cultures in which full ordination was not available who have gone to Hong Kong or Korea or Taiwan to get full ordination, and there is debate in various Buddhist communities as to whether this is legitimate or not. The male Sangha is often quite resistant, because even when I've spent quite a bit of time in Sri Lanka, everybody was telling me, the 10 vow mothers, the Dasasila Mantas, these women who are taking the 10 vows, they're practiced much more purely than the men, but they're not formally ordained. They're really just lay women dressing up as nuns. So it's a very complicated thing. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm digressing, and you really want to hear about the Tantric period. And so what happens with the Tantras, and this is true to some degree in both Hindu Tantra and Buddhist Tantra. There's Jain Tantra too, but I know next to nothing about that. Is that it's part of a whole larger movement. And it's reminiscent in a way of the rise of the cult of Mary in the West. People talk about it in terms of sort of reintroducing the power of the feminine. And that's part of the point in Tantra. Part of it is, of course, that there were these practices that were developed in both Hindu and Buddhist traditions that were supposed to be spiritually beneficial. But it also had, on a larger social scale, to do with an attempt to counter the suppression of women. Now, I'm not making the claim, and I don't think it's historically correct to make the claim that Tantra was all about the liberation of women. There are some scholars who argue that actually all the highest Tantras came from circles of females, and I just don't think we have good evidence of that. But it's clear that in Tantra in general, the female is respected, and if there's one very, very explicit indication of this, whatever murky the historical material may be, it's in the fact that one of the primary tantric vows you take, if you take a highest yoga tantra initiation, is not to disparage women. Now, what disparage means is open to question, and we shouldn't assume that somehow Tantra traditions wrought this entire revolution in gender consciousness in 8th century India. It didn't happen. But Tantra, at least, and some of the bhakti or the devotional traditions within Hinduism also make very powerful gestures in this direction. There's at least an attempt to undercut these notions of Brahmanical purity and superiority, and the classic expression which comes from the laws of Manu, one of the great Hindu sort of social codes, is that, and I'm sure you've probably read this or heard this, a woman should be subject to her father when she is young, her husband when she's married, and her son after she's widowed. And that pretty much covers it. So, but the Tantra traditions, some of these other devotional traditions, push back against this, and there's this classic list of 84 Mahasiddhas, right? These great tantric adepts in India. 80 of them are male, but there are 4 females, and this illustrates both that Tantra tradition was more open to the social and other possibilities for women, but also that the system didn't change really that much. when I was first studying Buddhism, people assured me, oh, Tibetan women are, very much freer than women in India. And then there are ways in which some of this is true, but traditional Tibet was a patriarchal culture, like pretty much every pre-modern culture has been. It's not entirely an accident that the most common word for woman is kimin, which means low birth.
What?
Yeah. Ke means birth, men means like low. Yeah. So, it's it may be that the English word woman. I can't do the etymology of our own words for females, but this I think is actually built into many languages. The Tibetans are not unique in this respect. But anyway, but at least in a general sense, in the Tantra tradition, there was a bit of pushback against this, and definitely, there's debates that go on as well about whether, quite frankly, whether the women who have been consorts to male practitioners have been used, or if you will, in the extended, current sense of the term, abused, right? And there was a Western woman who wrote a scathing book about the tradition, who says she was the consort of this very well-known Lama and that she wasn't treated well. And there's a great deal of...
And that's my question goes to that. How can they reach enlightenment when they're taking advantage of another living being?
Well, if that's what they're doing, then that's a real problem. The ideal within the tradition, I suppose the absolute ideal is that the male and female both be of more or less equal spiritual attainment, and it therefore becomes a mutual process. But I think that even if that ideal is not fulfilled and the consort is less accomplished, we're talking. I'll just talk male female right now. We can imagine other combinations, of course, but the assumption is that at the very least the male practitioner is actually in effect supposed to treat the consort as a goddess, so deeply to respect her, whether then she is simply being utilized for the male spiritual purposes. I suppose if she is well treated, the presumption within the tradition would be that this is very good for her karmically, that it will help advance her eventual enlightenment, something like that. It's as they say in cricket, a sticky wicket.
Maybe that's why, the traditions that want only men in their clubs, or saying it like that, don't want to include women because they want to keep the tradition of using consorts, probably.
Yeah, I don't know about that particular. I mean, this is something I don't know at all firsthand. So, and I sort of know what I read and occasionally hear. But certainly these things happen. They have always happened, and they probably will continue to happen. But the social pressures and expectations in this or that culture tend to differ. Yeah, sure.
I have a question. What does these teachings say that are the signposts on the way, or the signs of progress toward enlightenment?
Well, there's different traditions that will talk about this in different ways. The most important signpost is when your teacher tells you, oh, you're getting somewhere. Or even if the teacher says, you're screwing up, go back to the cushion. That's probably the most important. But there are various descriptions. What comes to mind immediately is probably not that relevant to most of us, but it's said that when you're making progress in tantric meditation, particularly at the very advanced levels, there are particular signs that you will see internally. Actually, some of these correspond to experiences that we will have as part of the death process, mirage or sparkling like fireflies or things like this. But there are, I'm kind of blanking on what most of the traditions talk about, but there are definitely signs, and you can find them specified in texts. Probably I can't think of any because I haven't seen any recently, but but there are definite indications. Sometimes dreams are considered to be, to tell us something. And of course the Tibetans developed, or actually the Indians developed, and the Tibetans continued a whole dream yoga practice that is actually one of the 6 yogas of Naropa, which in turn are the kind of core of Tantric Mahamudra in the Kagyu school. So, but since the 6 yogas of Naropa were also taught to Tsongkhapa, he actually wrote 2 texts on the 6 yogas of Naropa, both of which have been translated by Glenn Mullen. So dream yoga is something that's known in the Gaelic as well. And it's widespread, actually. I wouldn't be surprised if it's in Sakya as well. And I haven't specifically run into it there. So, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of concrete examples. But, yeah. Okay. Well, maybe we'll try to get through a poem. Alberto's been really hoping that I would just keep talking. Poetry is hard, and I will try to go slowly. We will look at the first one. I don't know, I always feel like poetry is a good way to end things, sometimes to begin things too. And as I commented before, the Panchen wrote quite a number of poems that either explicitly or implicitly talk about his Mahamudra experience. And this is, it's common even for very highly educated Tibetan monks also to write these songs of experience. It's really on the model of the kinds of songs that were written by the great Mahasiddhas, the great tantric adepts of India, like Saraha, Tilopa, Naropa. They all sang, again, somebody asked me the question, right, about poetry and its appropriateness, and I tried to argue that when it comes to things that are so hard to describe, poetry may be the best way we have to try to, some people would say actually music is even better, but, and of course, many of the songs that at least the Indian adepts sang had melodies. Some of them have been handed down into Nepali traditions, and whether the tunes we have now are the same as what they were 1,000 years ago in India, hard to say. Anyway, but poetry is there as a almost, you have to understand that poetry was a deep part of the cultures out of which this came. Poetry to us is often limited to a book, or maybe we remember something from childhood, and it's not, a lot of people just don't even read poetry, but these are cultures that were primarily oral, and in which, as I pointed out, verse, meter were very important. And so it was easy and natural for these great siddhas to express their realization kind of naturally in poetic form. And there are figures nowadays, I don't know how many of you have heard of Kandrona. She is a great female adept who has actually, after Lama Zopa suffered his stroke, or displayed his stroke, she helped him a great deal, but he's deeply revered in all the traditions. And I've seen, you can go on YouTube and watch her spontaneously compose this perfectly metered 25-minute song about realization. So, this stuff happens now too. It's not just ancient. Now, whether the Panchen sang these, I don't know. Some of these are literary productions, this may well be, but it doesn't matter. It's an attempt to capture the same spirit. It's basically it's poetic, it's the yogi's joy, or the yogini's joy. So he starts out here, Namo Guru Manju Goshaya, which is again, of course, the homage to Manjushri, who's the sort of the Buddha figure, and more or less at the head of this lineage. And he says, your body visibly blazes with meaningful brilliance. Your melodious speech sings forth in 60 voices. Your mind is a trove of knowledge and benevolence beyond samsaric existence and peace, peace being stand-in for nirvana. So to the lotus feet of holy Vajradhara, I bow down. So he's taking his guru as Vajradhara here, as being identical to the tantric manifestation of the Buddha. So he says, the mind, shaken by the demon of delusive grasping at things, imputes deluded exaggerations and clings to them. Through that, our own and others' lineages are broken, and we wander in samsara, driven by action and defilement. And just a classic depiction of what our problem is, like most of us are. If I do not slay the enemy, self-grasping, with a sharp sword of realizing things as they are, and there's this image of the sword that Manjushri holds, I will earn a fearful abode and won't interrupt the cycle of repeated suffering in this sea of samsaric existence. He goes on. I mean, a lot of this doesn't really require much commentary, I don't think. When it's seen that the objects of this illusion machine, the ignorant mind, I love that image of the ignorant mind as an illusion machine. We spit out all these fanciful things. When it's seen that these are unarisen from the start, that is, that their nature is emptiness, conceptually elaborated subjects and outer objects dissolve into the Dharma realm, that is, into reality itself, like ice in the vastness of the sea. So that's just a beautiful image of the sort of subject-object dichotomy and delusions just dissolving into emptiness, really. The actual primordial, abiding nature of all things, their inseparable meaning, is free from all elaboration. Again, this term elaboration, duality in effect. When you see for yourself such a realm whose nature cannot be shown by any example, again, always this gesture towards the fact that it can really be expressed. You can try examples, but none of them captures it. His nature cannot be shown by any example, or even the signs of the holy Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha cannot be imagined. So, even in this state, even Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, even the most sacred of things, they're not present. Then, where there is suffering, then where is the suffering of samsaric abodes seen as soiled by the stains of ignorant mind? There is no suffering in such a state. Awareness enters into the luminous realm and starkly sees the intrinsic nature of all phenomena. Even if you look again, you're beyond the realm of seeing. So again, it's a seeing that's no seeing. It's like searching beyond the edge of unobstructed space. So I mean, these are all ways of trying to describe the indescribable, trying to be finite, something that's infinite. All you beings in terror of samsara, take in the spectacle of basic truth, the empty expanse. When you see it, even if everyone in the world becomes your worst enemy, you've no need to fear. Not imagining actions of virtue or vice or their fruits, free as well from path, abandonment, antidote, refutation, or proof. So much for that, scholars. Apart from the fruits accomplished by the striving mind, in such a realm, think triumphant thoughts. But these are not dualistic thoughts. Doesn't mean that. Looking beyond the phenomena of samsara and nirvana, see just this fact. The Dharma of cause and effect is unfailing and subtle. This is another way of talking about dependent arising. Cause and effect, dependent arising, often synonymous. Like a rainbow path where immortals walk. No reference. I don't think this is a reference, incidentally, to anything like the rainbow body, but the middle path, i.e. Madhyamaka, united and free from extremes, on which there is no alternation of appearance and emptiness, very much like the point he made towards the end of the meditation text, the unelaborated real, primordially pure, where action, cause, and effect do not fail, a path such as this is attained through the Guru's kindness. Be kind, O you second conqueror Jay. Jay is another way of talking about Sankara, short for Jay Lama, Jay Rinpoche. And bless even unkind beings to realize an aim such as this. So, this is a somewhat more poetic way of evoking a great deal of what he was talking about in the meditation manual, particularly in that last section. We might have time to maybe go quickly through one more here. We'll just move to the second one. So again, the homage to Manju Gosha or Manjushri, to the Father who's like an untrue dream, performing magical feats in every land on the divine path, where awareness and the Dharma realm are inseparable. That is, the mind and emptiness are inseparable. I, the illusory sun, make heartfelt vows. All the things we view are just illusions, and when you look at reality, you see nothing. The path that unites illusion and emptiness through the Guru's kindness is this union attained. Allah. Again, this is one of these great Tibetan expressions. Free from extremes of is or isn't, I rest in equipoise in the realm beyond extremes. That's going to be the kind of refrain in this song or poem. When you look at reality, things are resplendent. When you examine things, they slip into emptiness. The non-alternation of appearance and emptiness through the Guru's kindness is this union attained. Allah, beyond extremes of is or isn't, I rest in equipoise in the realm beyond extremes. Ultimately, cause and effect are shown to be unfailing. Discern the ultimate original face of conventions, the natural inseparability of the two truths. Through the Guru's kindness is this union attained. Allah, beyond extremes of is or isn't, I rest in equipoise in the realm beyond extremes. When you've cut to the ultimate realm, not even the phrase dependent arising exists. Yet emptiness and dependent arising are united. Through the Guru's kindness is their non-contradiction known. Through the Guru's kindness is this union attained. Allah, beyond extremes of is or isn't, I rest in equipoise in the realm beyond extremes. All phenomena of samsara and nirvana understand their truth by knowing they're untrue. The natural inseparability of true and false through the Guru's kindness is this union attained. Allah, beyond extremes of is or isn't, I rest in equipoise in the realm beyond extremes. Phenomena, which are only names, are empty of truth. Truly empty, all things appear as the play of cause and effect. The path where emptiness and cause and effect are inseparable. Emaho, through the Guru's kindness is it attained. Allah, free from the abyss of eternalism and nihilism. So, I think you just have to kind of let that wash over you and worry about what it all means later, perhaps. Anyway, that seems to be a nice Allah at the end. It doesn't really mean anything. It's just sort of an expression of joy. If you've ever, there are particular Tibetan ritual texts that have a tantric flavor to them that will often interject things like this. Allah, Allah. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm still in Allah land. Anyway, equipoise is meditative equipoise, that was the term that came up a lot in the meditation text, and it means a state of mental stability, basically equivalent to shamatha.
In Spanish, ecuanimidad, ¿verdad? Postura.
Yeah, balance.
Balance.
Yeah, mentally balanced, mentally stable.
Estabilidad.
Yeah,
Into the cushion.
yeah. Okay. All right, well then let us dedicate the marriage.
Que por medio de esta virtud pueda alcanzar realmente el estado puro Buda y pueda llegar a este estado a procesar sin excepción. En la tierra rodeada por montañas de nieve, eres la fuente de toda felicidad y bondad, todopoderoso esencia de existencia. Por favor, permanece hasta el final de esta samsara. Madre cae, liberado de samsara. Tú cae, liberado de los 8 temores. Cara, madre que libera, otorga el honor de la longevidad. Por la bendición de los gurús, raíz y de linaje. Por los logros espirituales de los jinas, dioses y diosas. Por los métodos años de la taquín y los protectores del Dharma, que podamos realizar gozosamente la esencia de nuestras esperanzas. Ven Tenzin, eres afable, benevolente y bondadoso. Por favor, permanece con nosotros durante una larga vida. Expande tus actividades iluminadas en todas las direcciones y continúa madurando y sustentándonos a mí y a todos los seres sintientes. Desde este momento y durante todas nuestras vidas, manténnos bajo tu tutela. Sé nuestro amigo, nuestro divino y virtuoso guía. Limpia la degeneración de la ignorancia. Ayúdanos a realizar rápidamente nuestro recorrido por los senderos y caminos y a alcanzar los 3 cuerpos de un Buda. Por la verdad de la realidad incambiable y por la bendición conjunta de la indestructible sangha, que la esencia de estas oraciones se logre rápidamente.